While Mexico was struggling with its own people, a great war was about to spread across the other half of the world. This war became so huge that for years people in Europe simply called it the Great War. Today, we call it World War One. While Mexico was struggling with its own people, a great war was about to spread across the other half of the world. This war became so huge that for years people in Europe simply called it the Great War. Today, we call it World War One. World War One began in the Balkans. Remember how Bulgaria attacked Serbia back when the Balkan Peninsula was fighting for independence from the Ottoman Turks? Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece had been planning to divide up Macedonia, but Bulgaria didn't think it was getting enough land. After the attack, Serbia and Bulgaria were enemies, and Bulgaria began to make an alliance with Austria, also called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, since Austria was really the two countries of Austria and Hungary united under one Austrian ruler. If Austria was a friend of Bulgaria, Serbia would be Austria's enemy. The Serbs had another complaint against Austria as well. Austria had taken the little country of Bosnia and made it part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the people who lived in Bosnia were from the same ancient race as the people who lived in Serbia. Both were Slavic. Many Serbians thought that all Slavs should be united together and that no Slavs should be ruled by the Austrians. On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Serbian assassin named Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Australian throne. The assassination was a disaster. To start with, it almost didn't work. 6 teenagers, none of them older than 19, had planned to throw a bomb into the Archduke's car as it passed by. But the boy given the job of throwing the bomb missed. The explosion went off behind the Archduke's back fender. Immediately, police charged into the crowd and grabbed the bomb thrower. He tried to swallow a capsule of cyanide to kill himself, but he couldn't get it into his mouth properly. He was arrested at once and dragged off to jail. And at this, the other 5 boys fled. Gavrilo Princip went to a coffee house nearby to calm himself down by drinking a cup of coffee. When he finished his coffee, he stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked around. A car was coming towards him, the Archduke's car, leaving the scene of the bombing to take the Archduke to safety. Princip, hardly able to believe his luck, drew his gun and shot into the car, killing both the Archduke and his wife. The leader of Austria insisted that the assassination attempt must have been planned by the Serbian government. The Serbs' leaders denied it, but the denial did no good. On July 28, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia.
What is that?
2 other countries immediately got involved. Russia, an ally of the Serbians, started to gather its troops together to attack Austria. So Germany, an ally of Austria, declared war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany also declared war on France and started to march towards the French border. What did France have to do with the Balkans? Not a lot. The truth was that most of the countries of Europe were ready to fight anyway. For decades they've been arguing with each other about their borders, the size of their armies, and who got to control which colonies in Asia and Africa. And even though the bullet that killed the Archduke was often described as the bullet that started World War I, the Archduke's assassin didn't really cause World War I. When the German army began to march towards France, it went through Belgium, which had already been declared that the Belgians wouldn't get involved in the Austrian-Serbian quarrel. Now, Germany was ignoring a declaration of neutrality. So Belgium said they are neutral, they will not get involved in this war, and Germany marched through them anyway. And then they invaded yet another country. At this, the British began to worry. Remember, Germany had been building a new oil-powered ship for its navy, and Great Britain was already nervous about this growing fleet of battleships. If Germany was left alone, German soldiers might take over all of Europe. On August 4, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The war had truly begun. But before long, most of Europe was in on the fight. On one side was the Central Powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria and Germany, soon joined by the Ottoman Turks. On the other side was the Allied forces, Great Britain, France, Russia, China, Greece, Japan, Serbia, and a collection of other countries, including Belgium, which wasn't neutral anymore. No one believed this war would take very long. After all, the 4 countries of the Central Powers were defying the rest of the world. But it did. The fighting went on and on. Countries as far away as Australia and South Africa declared themselves ready to fight. Canadian soldiers marched off to fight in defense of Great Britain. The United States was one of the few countries that refused to get involved. Germany's new powerful ships sailed along the British coastline, attacking British vessels and merchant ships. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine fired a torpedo at a British ship called the Lusitania. The ship turned on end and sank. As the passengers scrambled frantically to get above the decks, almost 1,200 people drowned. That's 1,200 people. The rest of the world was furious. It wasn't carrying soldiers, it was a passenger ship filled with civilians. This broke all the rules of war. German submarines could torpedo British warships, but they were supposed to leave civilian ships alone. The United States government was particularly angry because over 100 of the drowned passengers were American citizens. For the first time, Americans began to think that perhaps the US should get involved in the Great War. By the winter of 1916, it seemed the war might never end. So Great Britain passed a new and frightening law. It declared that the British government could now order young men to join the army and go fight, even if they didn't want to. This was called the draft. Never before had Great Britain forced its men to join in on a war. The young men bravely went when called, but the war was dangerous, exhausting, and brutal. At the front, the place where the fighting between enemies actually took place, British soldiers sang a song that went like this: I don't want to go in the trenches no more, where whiz-bags and shrapnel they whistle and roar. Oh my, I don't want to die, I want to go home. The draft, of course, meant that even more men were away at war. Women had to begin working in factories and shops, driving trucks and doing other men's jobs. By 1918, almost 1 million women worked in British weapons factories. A 17-year-old girl named Lottie Wiggins, who drove a crane at one of the factories, described the long hours at her new job. We worked 12 hours a day, Monday to Saturday, then we changed to 18 hours a day, going on duty at 6 o'clock Saturday evening and working to 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Then, on Monday at 6 a.m., we would resume the normal 12-hour shifts. Meanwhile, young men from France and Great Britain traveled to the front, fought bravely, and died. In a 5-month battle fought at Verdun in France, 300,000 German soldiers and almost 500,000 French soldiers died. In another attack called the Somme Offense, 400,000 British soldiers died trying to push back the German army. In the Great War, Great Britain lost almost an entire generation of young men killed in the fighting. Those who survived were often crippled by wounds or by the sheer horror of their years of fighting. But the Allies refused to yield. Three years after the Great War began, Germany came up with an idea to bring it to an end. The Germans sent a secret telegram in code to the German ambassador in Mexico, telling him to make a deal with the Mexican government. If Mexico would fight on the side of Germans and Germany won, Germany would reward Mexico. It would take the land that America had claimed during the Mexican War and give it back to Mexico. That land included New Mexico, Texas, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado. But before the Germans could actually make this deal, British cryptographers, professional codebreakers, managed to get a copy of the telegram and decoded it. American newspapers published the contents of the telegram so that the American citizens all across the United States could read it. Both the British and the Americans were outraged by this sneaky attempt to pull the United States into the war. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Now American soldiers would join the British, Canadian, and French soldiers, along with the soldiers of a dozen other nations, in fighting against Germany and its allies. So let us review. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was because Serbia was angry because Austria had taken Bosnia, and Austria was an ally of Bulgaria. And then the assassin was a Serb named Gavrilo Princip, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. The two sides of World War II was the Central Powers and the Allied forces. Great Britain and World War I. In Great Britain passed a draft law which forced people to join the army, and then women took over the men's jobs, and hundreds and thousands of men were killed and crippled by the war. The United States and World War I. The United States first decided no, they're not going to join the war, but then they got angry when the German soldiers sunk the passenger ship, and then they were further angered by the German telegram to Mexico and their attempt to deal with Mexico. So the United States joined the war on April 6, 1917, and that's where we're going to leave it for this week.
That's all. I shouldn't have had those artichoke poppers.